All of my content is also posted on 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all of your Magic the Gathering needs, including articles, podcasts, and custom Magic the Gathering tokens and playmats. As a subscriber to my channel, you can use the discount code NEEDSAHONE5 for a 5% discount in their store. You can find the link in the description below. Hello everyone, I am NEEDSAHONE, and this is the November 2016 edition of Commander on a Budget. This is a monthly series I do around Commander decks, as you might have assumed from the name. And the decks are built on a budget for Commander. They're meant to be fun and competitive. They're under $100 in paper and usually under $50 online. This one's right around $100 in paper and around 25 tickets online. And also, before we get into talking about the deck, if you haven't already entered into my 2K giveaway, the giveaway I'm doing because I'm about to hit 2,000 subscribers, and in fact, I may have hit it by the time this video is up, you should, because you can actually win this entire deck on Magic Online if you enter. So anyway, now let's talk about the deck. So it's built around Padeem. Last month I did Depala, and I had done a poll. Padeem and Depala were the two that people were voting on for last month's Commander, and Depala only won by about 2 votes, so there was enough interest in Padeem that I said, you know, let's do Padeem, and I'm glad I did because Padeem was a lot of fun. So basically the deck is a mono blue deck that is really, really interested in artifacts, in part because Padeem can protect them with hexproof, and in part because she can draw you an extra card if you control the artifact with the highest converted mana cost. So as usual, I have things sort of divided into piles. We will first talk about just sort of the staples that we have that are just blue cards. We have some artifact staples in a separate pile because artifacts have special synergy with Padeem. These cards don't really. They're just cards that blue decks, especially mono blue decks, usually need, like Pongify, which is good because blue can't usually destroy creatures very well. Same with Rapid Hybridization. They're more or less the same card. And then, of course, Cyclonic Rift, a super powerful card that you can use to sort of reset your opponent's board for 7 mana. Confiscate is great. It lets you steal one of your opponent's permanents. And Curse of the Swine lets you get rid of a lot of problem creatures, although it replaces them with board tokens, but it's usually going to be worth it in EDH. So this pile here is all stuff that has special artifact synergy. Some of them are artifacts, some of them aren't. So because the deck is interested in having artifacts and artifacts with the highest converted mana cost, this deck just runs a ton of artifacts and tries to be really synergistic with those artifacts. So, for example, we have Saheeli's Artistry. I think it's probably close to being a staple in a mono blue commander deck anyway, because there's almost always an artifact to replicate as well as a creature. And in this deck, that's basically always the case, so it's a very strong card in this deck. Sharding Sphinx is sort of one of our win conditions, 6 mana for a 4/4, and then all of my artifact creatures, when they do damage, start spawning Thopter tokens, who are also artifact creatures. Actually, they are artifact creatures, so they also produce more Thopters, so it's sort of a snowball effect. Conduit of Ruin is not actually an artifact, but it does let me search my library for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater, which includes artifacts, and it also makes my creature spells cost 2 less to cast, the first one at least. Mirror Incubator is another win condition. Sometimes you can just have this in play. Your opponent's not really thinking about it, and you're like, well, I still have about 30 artifacts left in my deck. This deck obviously has a ton of them, and you can just sacrifice this and find as many mirror tokens, as many artifacts as you want to create mirror tokens. Darksteel Juggernaut, another potential win condition, just gets absolutely huge in a deck filled with artifacts. Mirror Works is a lot of fun. It lets me just start copying non-token artifacts when they enter the battlefield. Some are obviously more powerful than others, but it's often a very powerful effect. Thopter Spy Network gives us yet another way to draw cards, because Padeem doesn't do it enough for us, and makes us Thopter tokens that can help win us the game. Vidalcan Archmage plus Padeem is a pretty awesome little thing to have going on, because you can just end up drawing tons of cards, because you draw the extra artifacts and you can sort of chain a bunch of artifacts together. We have Whirler Rogue, who's comes into play with Thopters, but the thing that makes it really strong is that we can make one of our creatures unblockable until end of turn if we just tap 2 artifacts. So like making a 20/20 Darksteel Juggernaut unblockable. Arcbound Crusher gets bigger every time you play an artifact. Also has modular, so I can put the tokens onto artifact creatures. Arcbound Reclaimer is less frequently going to be like a creature using its modular counters to put on things. Usually, though, I'll be using it to put artifact cards from my graveyard on top of my library, powerful ones that have been destroyed. Lodestone Myrrh is another potential win condition, can just get huge with all the artifacts. Trading Post is a great little utility card in general, but especially in an artifact deck, because we can sack artifacts to draw cards without too much effort. We can return artifacts from our graveyard to our hand without too much effort, and it also, of course, has the other effects of gaining life and making goat tokens when necessary. Shimmermer is a great little card that gives all my artifacts flash, which is pretty nice. Foundry Inspector makes all my artifact spells cost 1 less. Etched Champion is just usually going to be unblockable and or capable of blocking forever in this deck because Metalcraft is almost always on. Chief of the Foundry makes artifacts cheaper. Grand Architect is a really cool card. I mean, it'll pump Padeem and my other blue creatures, which I have a few of, but the coolest thing it can do is end up ramping me a ton so I can play some of my big scary win conditions early. Trinket Mage lets us search for one of our converted mana cost 1 or less artifacts. Treasure Mage lets us search for a win condition, basically, an artifact with 6 or greater. Renowned Weaponsmith lets us ramp for artifacts. I don't run Heart Piercer, Bow, or Vial of Dragonfire because they're pretty bad, but I like the ramping effect. Vedalken Engineer does basically the same thing. Mirror Retriever lets us return artifacts when it dies. Ethereum Sculptor makes artifacts cheaper. Chief Engineer gives all artifact spells Convoke, which is pretty sweet. Fabricate lets us search out, like, whatever artifact it is we need for a situation. Mycosynth Golem is one of the more powerful cards in the deck, also one of the more expensive cards in the deck, but I know I wanted it in here for a few reasons. First of all, it can let you do some crazy chain together things with Archmage and Padeem and all that, but also it has an incredibly high converted mana cost, and if this thing's in play and it has hexproof, and Padeem has hexproof too, which I'll talk about in a moment, I'm going to be drawing cards forever, basically. So it becomes very hard to deal with us unless our opponent plays a board sweeper. Metalwork Colossus, a new card that'll sometimes just be free in this deck and not hard to return to our hand. Broodstar is a big, scary flying guy with affinity for artifacts and power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts. Darksteel Forge makes all of our artifacts indestructible. And Gearseeker Serpent, another card with affinity for artifacts that is a potential win condition because it can become unblockable. So this pile here is all cards that sort of have some special synergy with Padeem. So Liquid Metal Coating can turn her into an artifact, meaning she gains hexproof, so it makes removal spells pretty difficult to use on her, at least spot removal. Lightning Greaves gives her Shroud, and the Greaves themselves will have hexproof, so very hard to kill her without a board sweeper. Swiftfoot Boots, same thing, except it gives her hexproof instead of Shroud. Mycosynth Lattice will make all of my permanents into artifacts, meaning they all have hexproof. It does also make your opponent's permanents into artifacts. This is another one of the very expensive cards in this deck. It's like a fifth of the cost of the deck, but it's just so good in this deck you can't really get around playing it. But it's very good with Padeem in play. And then we have Alhamarit's Archive, which starts making it so we draw 2 cards a turn with Padeem's ability, and we do have a few incidental sources of life gain, like Trading Posts, that get even better with the Archive in play. And then over here we just sort of have miscellaneous artifacts. They don't have artifact synergy, but we'll talk about them. It's worth noting we do have several ways to search our library for artifacts, so it's not that hard to get one of these 4 cards to sort of set up Padeem drawing cards forever and being difficult to kill. But we have, some miscellaneous artifacts here, like Inkwell Leviathan, which is just a big monster that's incredibly difficult for people to deal with if you can stick it. It'll have both Shroud and Hexproof if you have Padeem in play. Brittle Effigy is a removal spell, so it's nice being able to tutor for it. Blue itself just doesn't have very many removal spells anyway. Soul Ring, of course, is staple. Ratchet Bomb is a nice way of blowing up like a bunch of tokens. It's a nice way of blowing up a few problem permanents. Thalwar Stone, just a mana rock. Manalith, just a mana rock. Some of these are just cards you'd put in many commander decks, but I have them separate because Padeem has obviously synergy with any artifacts. Palladium Myrrh helps us ramp. Cultivator's Caravan helps us ramp while also sort of being a way to get in for some damage because it's a vehicle. Crawl Space makes it so our opponents can't attack us with a lot of creatures at once. And this deck is fairly controlling, so it's fine with a few creatures attacking at a time and just having a million cards in my hand. Arena of the Ancients is a nice thing to search for, especially against opponents who have very, very, like their strategy is a Voltron strategy or something. And you can just you can search for Arena of the Ancients or, draw it or whatever you do. And you don't care that your Padeem's tapped. Padeem never does anything, really. I mean, occasionally he'll attack for a few damage, but she doesn't do much. So your opponents are generally going to care more that their commander's tapped than you are. Hedron Archive, another way to ramp. Tameo's Journal is great because it gives us more artifacts, because it gives you clues. On top of that, if you want to, instead of drawing the cards, you can use the clues to search your library for any card you want. Orbs of Warding gives us hexproof, a very relevant effect, and it makes each damage source do 1 damage less. Steel Hellkite is just a great staple in general, but obviously great in this deck. You can just blow up a ton of permanents at once with it. Staff of Nin lets us draw even more cards and can also be a very, very slow win condition or a way of killing opponents' small creatures. Duplicant, another card that's basically a staple. It's just a removal spell attached to an artifact. Dreamstone Hedron, another mana rock that can draw us cards. Spine of Ishsa, another removal spell, but it works well with sacrifice effects and things like that. Mere Battlesphere, another way to win the game. We do have additional Mir in this deck, but obviously this comes with a bunch of them on its own. And here's another one of those, just another ramp source. And Biden of Thassa, yet another way to draw cards. So basically this deck draws tons of cards and just like outcards the opponent. We'll talk about our lands real quick, other than all of our basic islands. We have Blighted Cataract to draw us cards if we need them. Buried Ruin has some special artifact synergy. It returns them from my graveyard to my hand. Darksteel Citadel, just an artifact land that's indestructible. Foundry of the Consuls gives us Thopter tokens. And Inventor's Fair, brand new card that's very good in this deck. It'll usually gain us life, and when we feel like it, we can use it to search our library for any artifact. And we do have one more non-basic land, and that is Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, which we can use to add 2 mana to our mana pool for artifacts. So this deck can basically just ramp a lot, play big, scary artifacts, control the game, draw a ton of cards, so it's a lot of fun to play. I'll now play 3 games with it. I hope you'll enjoy those. If you want to make sure you catch Commander on a budget each and every month, don't forget to subscribe. If you think this deck is sweet, don't forget to click the like button. And if you have any questions or comments about the deck, you can post them below.